The German soldier was certain he was about to die. He had surrendered barely an hour ago, and now he stood in the hands of the enemy his own government had spent years teaching him to fear, as brutal, degenerate, a mongrel people with no honor and no mercy. He knew, or thought he knew, what happened to men who fell into American hands. So when the American guard walked toward him, he set his jaw and braced for the worst thing he could imagine. The American handed him a cigarette. And in that small, almost meaningless gesture, a tired guard sharing a smoke with a beaten enemy, the first crack appeared in a wall of belief that the German soldier had carried his whole adult life. It would not be the last crack. Over the months that followed, everything he had been told about the Americans would come apart in his hands, piece by piece, until the man, who had been sure he was going to die, instead, found himself facing a far stranger and more disorienting fate. He was going to be treated better by his enemy than he had ever been treated by his own side. This is not the story of a battle. It's the story of what America chose to do with its enemies after the shooting stopped, and how that choice ended up winning a victory no weapon ever could, because hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were captured and brought across the ocean into the United States, and a remarkable number of them would spend the rest of their lives remembering it not as their darkest hour, but as one of the best things that ever happened to them, and doing everything in their power to get back. Here's the question that should stop you. How does a man who arrives in a country in chains, as a defeated enemy, guarded and imprisoned and far from home, end up loving that country? How do you take the soldiers who came to kill you, lock them behind wire, and turn so many of them into men who, given the chance, would choose your nation over their own? To understand that, you first have to understand what the German soldier expected, and you have to take it seriously, because his fear was not unreasonable. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted a very specific picture of America and of what capture would mean. The Americans were described as soft and decadent, yes, but also as cruel, as a chaotic and mongrel nation without discipline or honor, the kind of enemy who would abuse, starve, or simply shoot a helpless prisoner. And the German soldier had every reason to brace for harshness, even without the propaganda, because he understood something simple and human. He was the enemy. These Americans had every reason in the world to hate him. He and his comrades had killed their friends. Whatever mercy existed in war, he had little reason to expect it would be extended to him. A man in that position, standing disarmed in front of the people he had been trying to kill, expects the worst. It is the natural expectation of a prisoner in any war in history. So the German soldier braced for cruelty. What he got instead was so far outside his expectations that it began, slowly, to dismantle everything he thought he knew. It started on the journey, before he ever reached a camp. Enormous numbers of German prisoners were shipped across the Atlantic to the United States, and then moved by train, deep into the American interior, to camps scattered across the country. And on that journey, pressed to the windows of the train cars, the German soldiers saw something that struck many of them harder than any weapon had. They saw America itself, untouched. Understand what that meant to them. These were men who had lived for years inside a continent at war. They had seen bombed cities, rubble, rationing, factories in ruins, the grinding scarcity of a nation bleeding itself dry. And now, rolling past their windows, was a vast country that the war had never physically touched. Endless farmland, heavy with crops. Cities lit up at night, whole and bright and unbroken. Factories running at full tilt, roads full of cars, shop windows full of goods, people going about their lives in a prosperity that the German soldier had been told did not really exist. He had been assured his country was winning, or at least holding its own. And here was the enemy's homeland, thousands of miles wide, rich beyond anything he had imagined, and completely unscarred. Some of them understood, in that moment, staring out a train window, that the war was already lost, not because of a battle, but because of a landscape. Then they reached the camps, and the second wall of belief came down. The United States had chosen, as a matter of policy, to treat its prisoners of war according to the rules, the international conventions governing the humane treatment of captives. And America did not treat this as a technicality to be observed grudgingly. The prisoners were housed in real barracks. They received medical and dental care. And they were fed by the terms of the conventions, on the same scale as American troops. For men who had been living on the thin, failing rations of a collapsing war machine, the food alone was staggering. Meat, coffee, bread, vegetables, in quantities that seemed impossible. Some prisoners, in their letters and later accounts, admitted with something close to shame that they were eating better as prisoners of the enemy than they had as soldiers of their own country, or than their families were eating back home. Now, zoom in. From the scale of hundreds of thousands of men down to one of them, because the numbers only matter when you can feel them in a single life. Picture a young German prisoner, a farm boy or a factory worker before the war, sitting down to his first full meal in an American camp. He had come here expecting punishment. He had been told these people were his enemies and would treat him as such. And in front of him was more food than he had seen in years, served without cruelty, by people who owed him nothing and had every reason to hate him. He does not know what to do with it. It does not fit the story he was told. And quietly, without any dramatic moment, the story begins to lose its hold on him. Before we go any further, I want to stop for just a moment and hear from you, because this history belongs to the people watching it as much as to anyone. Wherever you are in the world right now, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching this from. And if you served, or your father or your grandfather did, tell me that too. And tell me the part of this history you're most passionate about. I read everyone, and it means more than you know to see who's out there. Now, back to that prisoner, and the thing that happened next that no propaganda could ever have prepared him for. Because the camps were not just about food and shelter. The Americans did something with their prisoners that, on its face, sounds almost absurd for a nation at war with them. They put them to work, and they paid them for it. With so many American men away at the front, there was a desperate shortage of labor at home, especially on the farms and in the food industries. So enormous numbers of German prisoners were put to work, picking crops, working in canneries, cutting timber, laboring in the fields of the American heartland. And under the rules, they were paid for their labor. Not much, but real wages, in scrip they could spend at the camp store on small comforts. For the first time, some of these men were doing honest work, being paid honestly for it, and spending it on things they chose. Farmers who had been terrified to have enemy soldiers working their land often found, to their surprise, that these were just tired young men who worked hard and wanted no trouble. And some of those American farm families and German prisoners formed bonds that would last for decades, long after the war was over. And it went further than work. In many camps, the prisoners organized their own lives with the freedom the Americans allowed them. They put on plays and concerts, they played sports, they set up classes and libraries. Some were even able to take courses at a level that could count toward a real education. Later in the war, the Americans went further still, deliberately using the time in the camps to expose the prisoners to ideas about democracy, freedom, and self-government. Not through force, but through newspapers, films, discussion, and simply the daily experience of how the country worked. The German soldier who had been raised inside a dictatorship, told what to think and punished for asking questions, found himself living, of all places, as a prisoner inside a small, working example of a free society. Put yourself now inside that man's mind, because this is the crucible of the whole story. He had been handed, since boyhood, a complete picture of the world. His own nation was strong, righteous, and destined to win. The enemy was weak, cruel, and hollow. And every single day in that camp, the picture cracked a little more. The enemy was not cruel. The enemy was feeding him, healing him, paying him. The enemy was not weak. The enemy's homeland was so rich and so vast and so untouched that his own country's claims of victory now sounded like a bad joke. The enemy was not hollow. The enemy was showing him, in the way it treated even its prisoners, a kind of confident decency he had never been taught was possible. Everything he had believed about why his side was right and would win was dissolving. Not because anyone forced it out of him, but because the plain evidence of his own eyes would no longer support it. That is a profound and disorienting thing to happen to a man. To discover, in captivity, that the enemy you were taught to hate is the one treating you with humanity, and that your own leaders lied to you about all of it. Many prisoners have written about the strange grief and relief tangled up in that realization. The grief of understanding how thoroughly they had been deceived, and by their own country. And the relief, almost the wonder, of finding that the world contained more decency than they had been promised, coming, of all places, from the enemy. And understand the sheer scale of what we're talking about, because this was not a handful of men in one unusual camp. The United States took in hundreds of thousands of German prisoners over the course of the war, a number that ran into the high hundreds of thousands, and housed them in a vast network of camps spread across almost the entire country. There were camps in nearly every state, from the deep south to the northern plains, many of them tucked beside small rural towns that had never seen a foreigner, let alone an enemy soldier. This was not a secret experiment in one location. It was a countrywide reality, unfolding in the backyards of ordinary Americans on a scale most people today have completely forgotten. For a few years, small-town America and the soldiers of the German army lived side by side, and what happened between them, quietly, in all those little places, is the real heart of this story. Now, honesty demands a caveat here, and it matters. This was not a fairy tale, and not every prisoner was won over. Some remained hardened believers to the end, and there were camps where committed Nazis intimidated or even killed fellow prisoners who showed signs of sympathy for the Americans. The treatment was humane, but it was still captivity, behind wire, far from home, and no one should pretend it was a holiday. And the Americans did not do all of this purely out of the goodness of their hearts, treating prisoners well, kept them orderly, freed up guards, filled a labor shortage, and complied with conventions that protected American prisoners in enemy hands, too. The humanity was real, but it was not naive. It was decency that also happened to be smart. But that is exactly what makes the result so remarkable. Because when it was over, and the prisoners were finally sent back, something happened that no amount of cynicism can fully explain. The end of their captivity was, for many, a shock of a different kind. When the war ended, the prisoners were not simply released in America. They were repatriated, but often not straight home. Many were sent first to Britain or France to provide labor for the shattered countries they had helped to ruin, and only later returned to a Germany that lay in rubble, occupied, starving, and broken. The contrast could not have been more brutal. They left behind the rich, orderly, well-fed country that had held them prisoner, and came home to a homeland in ashes. And for a great many of them, that contrast crystallized something they had felt in the camps, but not fully admitted. That the best years of their war, strange as it was to say, had been the years they spent as prisoners of the enemy. Bring it down, then, to the kind of scene that played out 1,000 times over. A German prisoner is trucked out each morning from his camp to work on a nearby farm, where the sons of the house are away at war and the family is struggling to bring in the harvest. At first there is fear on both sides, and stiff silence. The prisoner works hard, because he is that kind of man, And because work is better than sitting behind wire, the farmer notices. A week passes, then a month. The wife starts leaving out extra food. At noon, instead of eating apart, the prisoner is waved over to the family table. They cannot speak much of each other's language, but they share a meal, day after day, until the strangeness wears away, and what is left is just people. By the end of the season, the enemy soldier has become, almost against everyone's will, something close to a friend. And when the war ends, and he is finally taken away to be sent home, there are handshakes and addresses pressed into hands, and in more than a few cases, tears on both sides. Those addresses mattered, because years later, when the letters started crossing the ocean, and then when the former prisoners themselves started coming back, this time as immigrants, as free men, some of them stepping off a boat to be met by the very farm family they had once worked for as a captive enemy. It was those small human bonds that pulled them. They were not returning to an idea of America. They were returning to a table they had once been waved over to, in a country that had shown them decency when it had every excuse not to. The man who had arrived in chains, expecting to be shot, came back of his own free will to build a life. And somewhere, an old farmer who had once been afraid to have an enemy soldier on his land stood on a dock, waiting to welcome him home. And so, in the years that followed, one of the most telling verdicts of the entire war was delivered, quietly, one person at a time. Large numbers of former German prisoners, once they were able, emigrated to the United States. They came back on purpose, as free men this time, to build lives in the country that had once held them behind wire. Others kept up correspondence for decades with the guards who had watched over them, and the farmers whose fields they had worked, exchanging letters and Christmas cards, some even returning to visit the towns near their old camps as honored guests. Men who had been sent to America as enemies, in chains, chose it as their home. There is no propaganda victory in history quite like it. The soldiers a nation sent to destroy you, deciding, after seeing how you lived, that they would rather be one of you. That is the quiet triumph buried in this whole story. America did not win these men over with a speech or a slogan or a threat. It won them over simply by being itself in front of them, by showing a captured enemy, day after day, an abundance he could not deny, and a decency he had been told did not exist. The German soldier had been armed by his leaders with a lie about America. And America disarmed that lie, not with an argument, but with a cigarette, a full plate, a fair wage, and a country so plainly better than the one he'd been told to hate that his own eyes rebelled against the propaganda. Come back at the end, to that first moment, the beaten soldier braced for death, and the guard holding out a cigarette. Everything that followed was contained in that small gesture. The German had expected the enemy to prove the propaganda right, to be the monster he'd been promised. Instead, the enemy proved the propaganda a lie, over and over, until the man could no longer believe the story he'd been raised on. He had come to America expecting the worst of a nation. He left, and in many cases came back for good, having found something his own leaders had sworn did not exist. There is a deeper lesson in it, and it is the truest kind of strength. Any country can defeat an enemy on a battlefield. It takes a rarer kind of power to defeat an enemy's hatred, to take the men sent to kill you, and, without cruelty and without force, show them a version of the world so much better than the one they were fighting for that they change their minds about which side they wish they'd been on. Germany sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers to America as prisoners of war. And America sent a great many of them home as quiet witnesses to something their own propaganda had spent years denying, that the enemy they had been taught to despise had built a country worth crossing an ocean, twice, to live in. In the end, the most damning testimony against everything the German soldier had been told did not come from an American speech or an American gun. It came from the German soldiers themselves, from the men who saw America up close as its prisoners and decided that the enemy's country was the one they wanted to call home. They had been sent to conquer it. Many of them ended up begging to belong to it. And there is no verdict on a nation more powerful than the one delivered by the people who once tried to destroy it and chose it anyway.